Reciting the Lord's version, text number 38. Shri Sukachaya Sampadishyevam ajano Jnanam paramestinam Pashtastha shatad rupam Apmano nyarunatari Shri Sukachaya Sampradishyevam ajano Jnanam paramestinam Pashtastha rupam Apmano nyarunatari Shri Sukachaya Shri Sukadeva Goswami said, Sampadisha, fully instructing Brahmaji, Evam, thus, Ajana, the Supreme Lord, Jnanam, of the living entities, Paramestinam, unto the Supreme Leader, Brahma, Pashtata, while he was seeing, Tasya, his, Tatrupam, that transcendental form, Atmana, of the absolute, Nyarunat, disappeared, Hari, the Lord, the personality of Godhead. Translation, Sukadeva Goswami said to Maharaj Parikshit, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Hari, after being seen in his transcendental form, instructing Brahmaji, the leader of the living entities, disappeared. Please repeat after me. Sukadeva Goswami said to Maharaj Parikshit, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Hari, after being seen in his transcendental form, instructing Brahmaji, the leader of the living entities, disappeared. Purport by His Divine Grace, in this verse it is clearly mentioned that the Lord is Ajana, or the Supreme Person, and that he was showing his transcendental form, Atmano Rupam, to Brahmaji, while instructing him in the summarization of Srimad Bhagavatam in 4 verses. He is Ajana, or the Supreme Person, amongst Jnanam, of all persons. All living entities are individual persons, and amongst all such persons, Lord Hari is supreme, as confirmed in the Shruti mantra, Nityo Nityanam Shaitana Shaitananam. So there's no place for impersonal features in the transcendental world, as there are impersonal features in the material world. Whenever there is Shaitana, or knowledge, the personal feature comes in. In the spiritual world, everything is full of knowledge, and therefore everything in the transcendental world, the land, the water, the tree, the mountain, the river, the man, the animal, the bird, everything is of the same quality, namely Shaitana, and therefore everything there is individual and personal. Srimad Bhagavatam gives us this information as a supreme Vedic literature, and it was personally instructed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead to Brahmaji, so that the leader of the living entities might broadcast the message to all in the universe in order to teach the supreme knowledge of Bhakti Yoga. Brahmaji in his turn instructed Narada, his beloved son, the same message of Srimad Bhagavatam, and Narada in his turn taught the same to Vyasadeva, who again taught it to Sukadeva Goswami. Through Sukadeva Goswami's grace and by the mercy of Maharaj Parikshit, we're all given Srimad Bhagavatam, perpetually to learn the science of the absolute personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna. Vanchakaparubhasha Kripasundho Evata Pratitanam Pavanabhyo Vaishnivo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shri Yadi Govinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Sukadeva Goswami said to Maharaj Parikshit, the Supreme Personality of Godhead Hari, after being seen in his transcendental form, instructing Brahmaji, the leader of the living entities, disappeared. It's quite an austerity giving class for me, and I was just thinking it's probably a greater austerity for you listening to me giving class. I was thinking the only easy thing in Krishna consciousness is taking prasadam. So seek for blessings, I can speak something of value. So Srila Prabhupada in this verse explains that Srila Prabhupada mentioned that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a Supreme Person. And all living entities are individual persons. So in the Srimad Bhagavatam, when Hiranyaksha got killed by Vrahadev, all the queens of Hiranyaksha and the relatives were lamenting very much for their dearly departed kind soul, Hiranyaksha. And then Hiranyakashipu, he went there to console the queens because they were lamenting so much. And he tried to console them because even though Hiranyakashipu was a demon, he had Vedic knowledge, so he understood the difference between the soul and the body. So he was instructing them with this science or the knowledge of, you're not the body, you're the soul, just to pacify the queens. And he couldn't do it. So he told a story in ancient history of a king called Suyagya. And this Suyagya was a great king, and he'd been killed on the battlefield, and he died with his teeth clenched because it was a Kshatriya. He got killed that way, fighting in battle. And his queens, they went to the dead body of the king, King Suyagya, and they were all holding and embracing the body. And they were lamenting so much that Yamaraj could hear them crying and lamenting from his abode. And he wanted that soul, because that's Yamaraj's service. He has to rectify that soul so it can move on to its next destination. And that soul of the king and the subtle body was hanging around that dead body, and it wasn't able to leave because he was attached to that body. So Yamaraj thought, well, I need to, allow these queens to let go of this body, to give them a sense of detachment, because this body needs to get burnt. When the body gets burnt, then there's no place for the soul and the subtle body to become attached to. So he decided to be a bit innovative, and he came as a little boy. Yamaraj turned into the form of a little boy, and he walked into this situation where the king was dead and the queens were, attached and holding to their husband's body. And Prabhupada mentions that a little child can walk into anywhere. No one prevents a child from walking to any place. And not only that, but the little children, if they speak philosophy, it's quite amazing. So he walked into this assembly where the queens were, and he said, "What are you doing?" to the queens. And they said, "Well, our husband's dead, and he's dead, but the body's here, but he's gone somewhere else." And the little boy said, "Yamaraj," he said, "well, if the king's gone, then why are you holding on to the body?" Because that's the person you love. Obviously you don't know the person who you're lamenting. And sometimes people nowadays, they think personalism is actually just based upon the body. So people hug people, and they shake people's hands, and they encourage people by patting their body, and they think this is real personalism. But Yamaraj is explaining to these queens that actually it's not the body that's the person, it's actually the soul. And Srila Prabhupada mentions that one of the fears of the living entity in the material world is to have a personal existence. And you can't have that when we identify with the body, because the body is just a dead piece of matter. It's the person within the soul that gives life to the body. And the reason why it's one of the biggest fears to have a personal existence is because to accept that we have a personal existence, that we're a soul, we need to engage in devotional service. And to engage in devotional service, we need to accept Krishna as a supreme person to direct our service towards. And the fear is that we think we're Krishna. With lifetime after lifetime, we've been in the material world thinking we're the controller and the enjoyer. And to now consider that we're not the enjoyer is a very fearful condition. It really takes a bit of an effort to work on this. And in the translation it says here, where there is Chaitanya or knowledge, the personal feature comes in. So spiritual knowledge removes ignorance of thinking we are the body. and establish our identity as a spirit soul. And the boat, the body has a good purpose in one sense. It's not very good to enjoy with, but in the scriptures it says that the body is like a boat. And just like a boat can cross the ocean, similarly this body can be a very nice instrument to cross the ocean of material existence. But also, it's not just good to have a boat. We need two other things. We need some wind to push the boat, and the wind are considered the favourable breezes of the scriptures, or these books of knowledge. And we need one other thing to help us ply the boat across the ocean, and that's just not the wind, it's also a captain. And the captain is a spiritual master. The books which are the favourable breezes, they help us understand we're not the body but the soul. And Srila Prabhupada says that these books, they're like law books. Just like a lawyer knows the law books really well, our spiritual teachers, they know these books of wisdom, books of Krishna consciousness extremely well. And our teachers have studied these books very, very thoroughly for a long, long time. And Daviyani and Kardama Muni, they had a son called Kapila Dev. He was the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And when Kapila Dev appeared, Daviyani's husband left. He renounced family life. And Daviyani was left with a son, Krishna, Kapila Dev. And she said to her son, it's quite amazing that how am I going to understand I'm not the body and the mind? Because I think I am these things, many years or many lifetimes I've identified with these things. How am I going to understand that I'm not the body and the mind? And Kapila Dev said to his mum, Daviyani, you're going to have to hear for a long, long time. A long, long time. And that's why we have to listen to these books like Srimad Bhagavatam for a long, long time, regularly. And Srila Prabhupada says that the spiritual books are like law books, so if we get into legal trouble, and one thing is recommended is don't try and represent yourself when you get into legal trouble. Quite often, people, they go into court and they want to represent themselves. They have like the law books, and they read the law books for a little bit, and they stand in front of the judge and they want to represent themselves. And only crazy people do this. Quite often the judge will go, are you sure you want to do this? Because the judge knows that if he represents himself, he's going to get probably a heavier sentence. So the judge will recommend to this person who go, why don't you get a lawyer? All right, because they understand these books very, very well. And just in the same sense, if we approach these books of wisdom, like Srila Prabhupada says, the law books, and we're trying to understand these books on our own, we'll understand them, but not to a greater degree. So Krishna recommends that we get a spiritual teacher, and he will help us understand these books very well. They will represent us. And it's explained that a good lawyer knows the books, but a great lawyer knows the judge. So our spiritual teachers are great. And the reason why they're considered great, because they know the personality who we're trying to understand through these books. And that's why we approach a representative, a spiritual teacher. And the general theme in these ancient books of Bhakti Yoga is that they teach us that we have to control the mind and senses. It's a bit of a bummer. So Srila Prabhupada says that life without sense control is animal life. And my spiritual master, Daviyani Swami, he says that human beings are like two-legged animals with credit cards. Very dangerous combination. So the result of uncontrolled mind and senses is that it causes us to identify with the material body. And in the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a story of King Ayati. And Parikshit Maharaj, he asked Sukachaya Goswami, he asked him, this King Ayati, he has a very unusual marriage. It's called a pratiloma marriage, because he was reading this. And a pratiloma marriage is when the wife has a higher position, a class, than the husband. It's very good if they're equal, right? Because he was a king and she was a brahmana, her family. So it was a bit not most beneficial. The ideal would have been if he was in a higher class than his wife or equal. So Parikshit Maharaj asked Sri Sukadeva Swami, how did this come about? So Sukadeva Goswami explained the story. And he said that one day, the two main characters, there was some queens or some princesses actually. They were bathing in a lake with their friends, and they were naked. And Daviyani, one character, she was the daughter of a great Brahmana priest called Sukachaya, and the other lady was Samista. They were friends, and she was the daughter of a king. So Daviyani was in a higher position class-wise than her friend Samista. So they were bathing naked, innocently, and Lord Shiva came past in his bull. And the young princesses and the maidservants saw Shiva, and they, out of shyness, they immediately left the lake and put on their clothes, their garments. And Samista had put on Daviyani's clothes by mistake. I don't know if this happens in the ashrams, but I was in the ashram sometimes. You go outside to get your dhoti in the morning and it's not there. Someone else has taken it. I don't know if that happens in the women's ashram, but I'm sure they don't appreciate it. But Daviyani saw this and she rebuked Samista. And she said, Samista, you're like a dog, right? You come to the sacrificial arena and you just steal clarified butter. So Daviyani then, because she's in a Brahmana class, and usually Brahmanas, they get maintained by the kingly order, because they're just priests, they just teach knowledge and not into working. So then Samista rebuked Daviyani. She goes, you guys are just like crow-like beggars that come to our house and just beg for food. And Prabhupada says, sometimes this is like womanly nature. And it's been going on since time immemorial. Men also do this as well. But and then Samista threw Daviyani into the well and went home. And then King Ayati, one of the main characters in this pastime, he was walking along and he went to the well to get some water. And he looked down in the well and he goes... He looked down and he saw Daviyani, who was in the well, and she was naked. And he became very attracted to her, and she looked up him and thought, wow, what a great hero. This king's come to save me. So he lent her his hand and he pulled her out. And then Daviyani said, now we are married. You gave me your hand. And the king thought, well, this is providence, so I'll go with it. So then once she got out the well, Daviyani went home to her father, and King Yadi went to the palace. And Daviyani complained to her father, Sukachaya, the Brahmana priest, and he was very angry at what had taken place to his daughter, had she been thrown into the well. So he immediately went to the palace to see the king, who was the daughter of Samista. And the king could sense that something's wrong, my guru is coming and he's angry. So he left the palace and immediately fell at the feet of the Brahmana and begged for forgiveness, and it wasn't working. And then the king said, all right, I will resolve this situation. I'll give you my daughter, Samista, who threw your daughter into the well, as a maidservant when they get married, when Daviyani gets married to the king. And all her friends, her maidservants, Samista's friends, will also join you in the palace, join Daviyani in the palace. So the king got married to Daviyani, and Samista, she came into the palace with all her friends. But the Brahmana priest, Sukachaya, he said to King Yadi, he says, control your mind and senses. Don't sleep with this other woman, Samista. Right? She's a maidservant to my daughter, so don't do this. So they were in the palace, and Daviyani became pregnant to the king. And Samista also wanted a son as well, because she got a bit envious, and she approached the king Yati for a son or for children, and the king couldn't refuse, because it's a religious principle. If a lady approaches a king for a child, he has to say yes. It's a religious principle. So he saw this as an act of providence, and she became pregnant, the maidservant. So Daviyani found out that her friend had become pregnant by the king, and she immediately went home to her father, Sukachaya, the Brahmana priest, and complained. And the Brahmana priest went to the king, King Yadi, and said, you lusty fool. I told you not to do this, and you didn't listen, and your mind and senses are out of control. He said, therefore I take away your invalidity. I take away your youth and replace it with invalidity and old age. I curse you to become old. So the king thought for this for a while, and he goes, well, it's not really in your daughter's best interest that I'm old, because it's not very good for her. She has to fulfill her desires as well. So the Brahmana priest, he thought about this and said, I'll restore your youth, or you can restore your youth if you approach a younger person and they agree to swap your old age for their youth. So the king then approached his younger son. He approached all his sons, but his younger son was submissive and understood religious principles, so he accepted this exchange. So he took the old age of his father, and his father, King Yadi, took the youth of his young son. And the reason why he got the youth is because he wanted to enjoy unrestricted sense gratification. So it's explained that the king was enjoyed, in many different ways. So much material opulence and so much enjoyment with his wife. And we may think, this is this isn't very good if you're doing this. But we all want to aspire for this in some degree. We all want to live forever. We all want to enjoy youth for a long time and have such nice material opulence. So it's not unusual. And quite often the stories in the Srimad Bhagavatam, they're actually directing all the teachings towards us. But the teachings in the Srimad Bhagavatam, they may seem a lot more elaborate and kind of far out. But we just don't have those facilities to enjoy like they did in previous times. But we're still trying to do the same thing as King Ayati. So King Ayati enjoyed like this for many, many years. And then he got to the point of becoming very, very frustrated because he was enjoying unrestricted sense gratification and his mind was out of control. And he comes to the conclusion, I don't want to do this anymore, I've really exhausted it. And then he thought, I'm just going to renounce it all. And then he saw his dear wife and he thought, well, I can't leave her entangled in it. I've also got to help her. So he told this story, a figurative story of the he-goat and she-goat. Because sometimes it's easier to tell a story about something which is a bit abstract than give, lessons directly to that person because they may not accept it so well. They may take it personally. So he told the story of the he-goat and she-goat, and he said one day this he-goat was walking through the forest looking for grass and food, and he came across a well where he saw a she-goat, and he thought, wow, she's got beautiful hips. And the she-goat looked up at him and go, wow, he's got a beautiful bodily structure and a nice moustache and beard. Even the animals see things attractive in themselves. And she goes, and he's also very expert in erotic activities. This is what the Bhagavatam says. So he got his horns and he dug the she-goat out of the well, and they just enjoyed for a little while, but then the he-goat saw another she-goat and decided to be with her. So that she-goat then went to her maintainer, the Brahmana priest, and complained. And the Brahmana priest went to the he-goat and he took away the sexual power of the he-goat. And then the he-goat complained, and then he got his sexual power restored. And then he went off and enjoyed with the she-goat. So the wife was thinking this was pretty funny. This is a real funny story, my dear husband. But then it clicked, actually, this is us. And this is really disappointing, we're living like goats. And she developed a sense of renunciation. And then they started to engage in activities of Krishna consciousness, Srila Prabhupada explains. They engaged in the regular principles of devotional service, because living a life of uncontrolled sense gratification, it doesn't satisfy. And what it does, it actually helps us or enables us to identify with the body more and more. And there's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita which helps kind of substantiate this. Yahi sansvasa jabokha dukkha yon evati adi antavanta kuntaya na teshu ramate buddha. So an intelligent person does not take part in the sources of misery which are due to contact with the material senses, O son of Kunti. Such pleasures have a beginning and the end, and so the wise man does not delight in them. So this verse explains that a wise person and an intelligent person, they understand that the contact of the senses with their objects is not going to last. It just lasts for a little time. And King Ayati understood this. He exhausted his attempts at sense pleasure, but eventually he ran to a roadblock. And that is why we see people that become frustrated in the material life trying to enjoy material variety. Material variety has to be there for pleasure. You can't enjoy nothing. There has to be varieties of things to enjoy. And in the purport, it is explained that in the spiritual world, everything is full of knowledge, and therefore everything in the transcendental world, the land, the water, the tree, the mountain, the river, the man, the animal, is of the same spiritual quality. So we can see in this part of the purport that there's lots of variety in the spiritual world. If variety weren't a part of the spiritual world, then why wouldn't Srimad Radharani doesn't cook the same preparation twice for Krishna? She always cooks different preparations eternally. She never cooks the same thing twice. So there's so much variety in the spiritual world. And that's imperfection because it's in relation to Krishna, and there's no sense of influence of time and space. It doesn't deteriorate. But in the material world, variety leads to frustration and disappointment. And a while ago, before the floods, I was doing books in Mullumbimby, and I came across a lady. I was showing the Bhagavad Gita to a lady, and she was very interested, and a friend came along. And I was showing the book, and at one point, one of the ladies, she announced, "This is nothing, all right? You're nothing, I'm nothing, everything's nothing." And I thought, oh, all right. And I said, Arjuna says to Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. I just, referred back to the book. I don't want to get involved in this. And then after a while, I showed the book, and she took it. And she was quite interested. And I said, people give a donation just to help with the printing and help our mission, what we're doing. And she goes, "How much do you want?" And I said, she got out her purse, and I said, "I want everything." She goes, "I'm not going to give you everything." And she said, "Why would I give you everything?" I said, "Well, that will leave you nothing." And that's what and that's your goal, is to have nothing. And she laughed, and she goes, "Well, I'm not going to give you everything, but I won't give you nothing, but I'll give you something." And then after we had a nice exchange, and she goes, "I'm really hungry, and we're going to find a place to eat." So I said, "Well, there's a place in Mullumbimby called the Cardamom Pod, and they serve really nice vegan vegetarian food. It's a Hare Krishna place." And I go, "Don't look at the front of the menu though." I said, "All your things that you like is on the back of the menu." And she goes, "What's on the back?" I said, "Well, nothing." I said, "You really get into that." And and we kind of left, we went on our own way. And funny enough, as I was walking around the street a bit later, and they were standing out at the front of the pub, I could see him from a mile away. They was like deciding whether to go in or out the pub. And as I walked past, I could hear him saying, "Let's go in. Do you want to get our favourite drinks? What's your favourite drink?" And I walked past, and I thought, this is life in the material world. People get frustrated at trying to enjoy material variety, and it doesn't satisfy. So the natural conclusion is that everything's nothing. Because if you can't enjoy nothing, there's no frustration and no disappointment. And we can see that trying to enjoy material variety in the material world, it's just on the bodily platform, and it's just due to people having uncontrolled mind and senses. And because I show the Bhagavad Gita a lot to people in the street, I definitely like showing this picture. It's a picture of the horses and the chariot, and you can see in this picture that the horses are out of control, and the horses represent our senses. And you can see in this picture the driver, he's having trouble controlling the horses. The intelligence is having very difficulty controlling the mind, which are meant to control the horses. And the chariot's our body, right? And it's a good vehicle to use. But in this picture, the passenger within the chariot's a soul, and you can see the soul is like hanging on for his dear life. He's very afraid, because if the mind and senses are out of control, it's very fearful for the soul, because we don't know what body we're going to end up in our next life. And King Ayati could see this coming, actually. He could see, if I continue on this path of uncontrolled sense gratification, I don't know where I'm going to end up. So, in the last paragraph, and we can see that when people try and enjoy material variety to the utmost limit, there's never a relief, or there's no retirement from these uncontrolled senses. And I went to Burley Heads once, and I was looking for some decorations for our festival, just to get some Balinese hut decorations. So I went to a Balinese hut guy. He had a big business in Burley Heads, and after a short conversation, he revealed that, I go to Govindas, with my family, and that we go there all the time. I think everyone goes to Govindas now. I meet a lot of people. And he revealed his story. He said, I had this business for many years, and at the age of 50, my wife and I retired we retired from the business, and we had millions of dollars, literally millions, from this big business, making Balinese huts for resorts, like in resorts and for pools and that. And he said all we were doing, we were travelling around the world, going on P&O cruises and flying here and there for the 5 years till we're 55 years of age. And then his friend was a big investor, like a property investor. He always had projects, and his friend would always encourage him, invest your money, I'll double it, I'll triple it, guaranteed. And it was an accomplished investor. So when he got to the point of 55, because he wasn't satisfied with enjoying so much, he wanted more and more, this Balinese hut guy. So he submitted to his friend. He said, all right, we'll invest all our money, the millions of dollars, and, we want to see some return. Well, it didn't return. When he signed over the money to this investor, he never saw the investor and his money again. He just left. And he was heartbroken. He said we had to go back in the business at age 55 and do it all again. And he was 65 years of age, him and his wife, and I could see, they were working hard, trying to build this fortune again. And no one retires, all right, in the material world from uncontrolled mind and senses. It drags people on to the point of death. But there's hope for us, actually, because Krishna, he offers us a retirement program from the mind and senses. And they are our practices of Krishna consciousness. And they're called the regular principles of freedom. And I just looked in the dictionary just before. It said regular principles are the assertion that we worship God in the way that He has recommended. That's what it means by regular principles. God has given us principles that we should follow to help control our mind and senses. And there's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita, Raga devesha vimuktestu vishayan indriyeshravan apavashe videhatma prasadam adagachati. It says that a person free from attachment, fear and anger, who is able to control the senses through the regular principles of freedom, can obtain the complete mercy of the Lord. So by engaging our senses in Krishna's service through the regular principles, which are activities of Krishna consciousness, we can become free from the dictations of the mind and senses. And they also help us become free from the bodily conception of life. Now, Parikshit Maharaj said to his father, he said, you have conquered everyone in the universe. Can anyone see what I'm doing? Yeah, blinking. When I blink, it has no effect, but when Hiranyakashipu would blink, all the demigods, they would fall unconscious. They were so fearful of him. All right, and Prahlad Maharaj, actually, he said to his father, you've conquered everyone in the universe, but you haven't conquered your mind and senses. Therefore, they remain the greatest enemy. All right, so therefore you are not free. And not only that, but it's very interesting that Prahlad Maharaj, even though he was a young 5-year-old boy, even though everyone in the universe feared Hiranyakashipu, Prahlad Maharaj, his father was so disgusted that he was a Vaishnava devotee of the Lord, his son, that he tried to kill him in many ways. And he couldn't kill him. And Hiranyakashipu, who was feared by everyone, became fearful of his young son. And the reason why Prahlad Maharaj was actually fearless of his father and his father was fearful of him is because he wasn't controlled by his mind and senses, and he didn't identify with the body. And he had taken full shelter of Krishna. So Hiranyakashipu was become very, very fearful in this way. And I did have an experience actually, just recently, of someone becoming fearful, all right, in life, particularly towards the end of death, because they identify with the body. And I got a call maybe a couple months ago from a person I'd meet on the street, and I'd always give him a book and he'd always give a nice donation. And he lived in Nimbin, and he was a bit of a hippie, and he called me up and he said, Charan, I'm leaving my body, I'm dying. And I'd known him for a couple of years. We weren't good friends, like best friends, but we respected each other. He knew I was a devotee, I'd give him books, and he was a devotee many, many years ago to a small degree. And he told me he's leaving his body, he's dying of cancer. and he wants to leave everything to ISKCON, right? His house, his property. And he told me a bit about it, and it's a bit difficult to kind of, the legalities to kind of work it out. But he said, come to my house and I'll show you. So I went to his house and I saw the property. There's a bit of like a hobbit house in the mountains, and would have been worth much, but the fact that he wanted to give it to Krishna, he gets so much benefit. And so I was working out a way to, in my own way, with some advice to acquire the property. And then next call I got from him, he was in hospital, and he said it's not very good, kind of in serious condition. And I spoke to the nurse, and the nurse said, he's not so well, he's getting a bit paranoid. Right? And I thought, all right, I'll go see him. But I spoke to him and he said, go to my house and I've got all my bank details there in the will. I'm leaving everything to ISKCON. And I've rejected all my friends, I've rejected all my family, I don't want anyone to get any of this. I just wanted to go to Krishna. So my wife and I, we went on this mission after the floods to go to Nimbin, and literally all the roads were like landslid and you couldn't get through, but there's one part you can go from Lismore to Nimbin, and then we had to go from Nimbin right into the mountains. And I can remember to go to his house, we went through a landslide place and they had like a roadblock, but they just had the witch's hat just a bit across and it seemed like you can go through. So we just drove through and we got to the other side of the roadblock and it was open. And I can remember a lady looking at me who was one of the roadblock people. She didn't notice we went through, and then as we went through the last roadblock, she looked at us. What are you guys doing? I saw the look on her face, it was terror. So we drove to this guy's house, his name's Ginger, and we tried to find the paperwork and we couldn't find it. We were a bit bewildered. So we came back to the roadblock and it was blocked this time. They totally shut it. And we said we just come through and it was open and now it's closed. And she goes, well, this place is very dangerous and it can collapse any moment. And we asked if there's any other place we can go get out. She goes, no, you're stuck here in the middle of the mountains in Nimbin. And then a few cars started lining up, and then at the end of the day, we had to wait there all day. At the end of the day, they opened it up and we got out. And I went to the hospital to see this Ginger, and I couldn't get in. It was just too late, So we went home, and then the next morning I rang him up, and just to let him know I couldn't get some of the details. And I actually rang up a lawyer in Sydney and I got some legal papers so we can sign some things over. And then I rang up the nurse and she put me on to Ginger, and I could tell within a moment, something's not right. He sounds different. And within a moment, he goes, Charana, you're a con artist. I thought, what? You're a con artist, Charana. And I thought, okay, Ginger, Hare Krishna. And then I said, good luck, call me when you change your mind. So I hung up and I thought, man, this Ginger just got conned by the material energy. He rejected all his friends, he rejected all his relatives, and now he rejected Krishna. The last opportunity to give something to Krishna, because we take everything from Krishna during our life, and at the last point, we have an opportunity to give it back to Krishna and get some benefit. So we can see that material energy is a con artist. Right at the last point of his life, he was convinced he wanted to give it to Krishna, and the material energy tricked him. So what happens is that fear arises when we identify with the material body. And you can imagine being in an apartment for like 70, 80 years, and then the landlord says, get out, right? You're not welcome here anymore, get out. And then we go, well, I'm not ready. I don't want to leave, I've got nowhere to go. And the landlord says, get out now. Well, I give you 2 weeks actually, I think that's law. Get out or we'll force you out. So death is like that for a person. People get forced out their hotel or out their body, and they don't know where they're going. And this fear arises because we identify with the body. And there's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita, actually, it says, Bhayam dvitiya binivesha chasad ishad apitesha vipayato smiti. It says that fear arises when the living entity misidentifies himself with the material body. And not only that, when he turns away from Krishna and he forgets his constitutional position as a servant, this happens because we're in the material world. And this bhayam, fear, it continues right to the point of death. And not only that, but when we leave the body, there's a sense of being displaced. I know there's a war in the world at the moment. on the other side of the world, and many people are displaced because they don't have a home to go to, right? There's millions of people who don't have a place to go to. So we can see in the material world, on a higher sense, that all living entities are displaced, right? Because we're not in our real home. We're in the material world, and everyone's wandering around, well, not everyone, most people are wandering around with an uncontrolled mind and senses and not knowing what to do. So in the last paragraph of this purport, it's explained that through Shukadeva Goswami's grace and by the mercy of Maharaj Parikshit, we're all given Srimad Bhagavatam perpetually to learn the science of the absolute personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna. So this is explaining, part of what they're revealing here is that we need to return to our original home, Krishna, where Krishna is. And that the uncontrolled mind and senses, this is the war that we're having in the material world. And to win the war, we need to practice Krishna consciousness or bhakti yoga. And therefore we can go back to the spiritual world and serve Krishna in unlimited spiritual variety. So I'm almost out of time. If anyone has any questions. I think we've got a microphone we can hand out. Yeah.
Gentleman named Burley Head. Is his name John Fulham?
I can't remember his name. It was a few years ago, but it's one of the only Balinese hut places in Burley, so it might be.
He's the one that sold us the restaurant at Burley Head. He told me the whole story. He rang me up some time ago.
Yeah.
And he told me exactly that. And his misery started when he sold out the restaurant. This was Krishna's mercy. When you like someone.
Maybe that's how his business got back on track, because he did some amazing service, selling the restaurant or serving that property to Krishna. Anyone else like to say something?
Hello Krishna, I have a comment and a question. The comment is just, it may be interesting, I don't know, but when they burn the body, so the soul doesn't stay attached to the body, they smash the skull, so it has nowhere to hide. So just a bit of point of interest. My question is about the hugging. The hugging, you were talking about it's impersonal, but in the scriptures there's many times when Lord Chaitanya embraces someone, so I would like you to maybe give us some example of when it's a mundane hug and when it's a spiritual hug.
Yeah. Yeah, we can see that a lot of people like to hug. I think they've even got a hugging guru, Guru Ma, who hugs. But if we're hugging people just on the fact that they're the body, and there's no deeper sense, they're a soul, then it's definitely a bodily conception. There's not really much to it. And but we can see in the spiritual world, particularly with Lord Chaitanya's pastimes, they don't identify with the body. They're spiritual personalities. And even as devotees, even though we identify with the body, but we also understand that we're a spirit soul and we're all service of Krishna. So when we hug and we have affection for someone, the affection isn't based upon, the body. It's more an affection of us being as servants to Krishna. And a good hug from a devotee is very nice, and a good pat on the back, because it's encouraging us to do nicer in our service, which isn't actually on the bodily platform. And we can see in the spiritual world, I haven't read Chaitanya Charitamrita so well, but I know, they do have loving exchanges with each other. And it's definitely not based upon the bodily conception, it's based on the spiritual conception that we're servants of Krishna. So as devotees we can hug and pat each other, but not just for the fact that they're the body, that we're a servant of Krishna. And that encourages people actually. It's a sign of affection. As devotees we give affection to each other as well. It's one of the 6 loving exchanges. Giving charity, receiving charity. That can also mean giving affection and receiving affection as well.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Even Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu embraced Sanatana Goswami when he had the skin condition. And it was normally people would avoid him. So Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu could see his exalted position as a great devotee. So body of a devotee is not even material anymore in the higher levels. So a body of a spiritual master, but the body of a sincere pure devotee is becoming transcendental also. So the higher benefits of the body. It's an appreciation and gratitude also. And of course, younger devotees encouragement. So the advanced devotee sees through this body perception of life and sees the soul, expresses appreciation and gratitude and love for that devotee with the physical body language, basically. We're expressing our love. And so that's amazing.
I think that's why they call him Shastra Shakshu over here, because he sees through the eyes of scripture. That's an amazing commentary. Thank you very much. Srimad Bhagavatam. Ki Jai.